Before we open these old names, tell me where you're listening from. What city holds your night right now? If you would, stay with this chronicle and subscribe, so the next sealed page is not read alone. Now, candle closer, breath quiet, and listen. Netheril did not begin as an empire. It began as a hardship with a horizon. In the far north of Faerun, when most human lives were counted in winters survived and graves remembered, there were clans who learned to read more than weather. They watched the stars because the stars were honest. They watched the wind because the wind never lied. They watched the long migrations of beasts because hunger teaches patterns faster than any tutor. And in that bleak discipline, something dangerous took root. The belief that the world could be rewritten. The lands that would one day be spoken of as Netheril were not a single realm at first, but scattered settlements and rugged folk spread across cold plains, forests, and stony uplands. They were not born with elven teachers at their shoulders, nor did they inherit ancient draconic hordes of lore by right. They stole time from famine. They stole warmth from cruel seasons. They stole knowledge from whatever traveler dared to pass through. Then came the first true rupture in the ordinary life of humans, the Nether Scrolls. Even to speak that name plainly feels like setting metal down on stone and hearing the echo carry farther than it should. In canon, the scrolls are remembered as an artifact of terrifying consequence, arcane texts or cylinders passed into human possession in an age when humans still felt small beneath older races. The exact path they took into mortal hands has been told in more than one way across editions and sources, but the constant is this: when humans had them, everything accelerated. Not gently, not safely. The scrolls offered principles, they offered pathways, they offered proof that the art was not only for the immortal patience of elves or the ancient hunger-slow minds of dragons. It could be systematized. It could be advanced. It could be made into a ladder, rung after rung, climbed by mortals who refused to accept that death should also mean limitation. From that moment, Netheril was no longer a place. It was a direction. The earliest Netherese arcanists were not yet the arrogant sky kings that later ages would curse. They were builders, obsessives, and survivors who learned that a well-cast spell could mean crops where none should grow, shelter where no timber stood, light where winter made the sun feel like a myth. This is how empires are truly born, not from crowns, but from solutions that become habits. In those first generations, power gathered around those who could command the art. Not because every wizard was wise, but because in a harsh land, utility becomes authority. The man who can purify water becomes a law. The woman who can mend a shattered roof in a breath becomes a leader without needing a title. The child who can call heat into a cold stone becomes a promise that the clan will not freeze. Yet even then, the seed of what would destroy Netheril was already present, because every solution is also a temptation. When magic turns hunger into comfort, someone asks why comfort cannot become luxury. When magic turns shelter into security, someone asks why security cannot become dominance. When magic makes one community thrive, another looks on with envy, and envy does not ask politely. Netheril's earliest cities rose with this silent pressure around them. They gathered people not merely by trade or by arms, but by gravity, the pull of civilization wherever spellcraft made life more predictable. Roads formed, markets formed, libraries formed. The art moved from being a rare, frightening marvel to being the core of culture. And that cultural shift matters, because it explains why Netheril became the greatest empire ever built in human memory. yet also why its fall would feel like a moral verdict written into the bones of the world. Other realms built around gods, kings, or bloodlines. Netheril built around capability. In the Netherese mind, achievement became sacred. This is not metaphor. In time, magic was treated as a kind of religion, discipline, hierarchy, and devotion, all directed toward mastery. If the gods existed, they were distant. If fate existed, it could be rewritten. If limits existed, they were challenges, not warnings. Even the language of Netheril's leadership reflects this. The arcanists who rose highest were not merely advisors. They became pillars of the state. And as they refined their methods, Netheril's society became stratified in a way that seems inevitable in hindsight. Those who could wield magic, those who supported those who wielded magic, and those who were left beneath the shadow of spells they could not understand. It would be comforting to claim this was always cruelty. It was not. At first, it was structure. Then it became entitlement. As Netheril matured, wizards did what wizards have always done when given time and resources. They competed. They cooperated when it benefited them. They formed schools and circles. They argued over theory and practice. They refined spellcraft, expanded it, and pulled it away from superstition into something almost industrial. But there was a hunger in their progress that the warm South did not feel. In the North, one mistake can kill a village. And if one mistake can kill a village, then the village demands certainty. Netheril demanded certainty from magic. That demand reshaped the art itself. Netherese wizardry became focused on reliability and scale. It became concerned with making magic persistent, repeatable, something that could support cities, not just adventurers. And slowly, quietly, Netheril began to step beyond what most mortals could even imagine as civilization. Around this point in the Chronicles, the common listener imagines towers and robes and ritual halls. That image is too small. Netheril's great leap was not a single spell. It was an ideology that magic should become infrastructure. The land began to change under their hands, not in one dramatic moment, but through countless choices made by people who believed that if something could be done, it should be. And so Netheril reached for an invention that would become its signature, its crown, and in a strange way, its coffin. The mythalar. A word that sounds beautiful until you understand what it represents. A mythalar was, in essence, a mighty magical engine, an artifact capable of providing constant magical power, a heart that could feed spells endlessly. Where ordinary spellcasting burns like a torch and fades, a mythalar is a sun caged in a device. It made possible what would otherwise be impossible: the sustained levitation and function of entire flying cities, called enclaves. This is where the tone of Netheril's story changes. Because the moment a city leaves the ground, it stops thinking like the ground. When you live above storms, storms feel like someone else's problem. When you float over forests and plains, distance feels smaller. When you look down on other people, you begin to believe you were meant to. The first enclaves were wonders. They were triumphs that must have seemed divine to those below. Massive structures lifted into the sky, drifting like slow-moving constellations of stone and light. They were not mere fortresses. They were living cities. They carried homes, halls, gardens, workshops, and the quiet hum of magic woven into daily life. To the Netherese, this was proof. Proof that mortals could do what had once belonged only to legends. Proof that the old order of the world could be revised. But there is a hidden consequence that follows every miracle. Once it exists, it becomes normal. And when miracles become normal, ambition stops being satisfied by miracles. Netheril's leadership, in time, became the arcanists who owned enclaves, who controlled mythalers, who directed the flow of arcane research and civic power. These were not kings in the usual sense. They were arch-wizards whose authority came from the sky itself, from the fact that their city could drift away from danger, away from rebellion, away from consequence. A floating city is the ultimate statement. It says, I do not need you. It says, I can leave. It says, the world beneath me is optional. That one truth reshaped Netheril's relationship with everything else. Neighbors, rivals, even the gods. And beneath the splendor, deeper tensions formed. Not every Netherese citizen lived in the sky. Many remained on the ground, in towns and cities that supported the Empire's vast needs. Farms, mines, trade roads, and the countless mundane labors that even the greatest wizards cannot conjure without cost. So two Netherils grew in parallel, the Netheril of the earth and the Netheril of the air. One looked up, one looked down, and in between them, the Empire's identity sharpened. Magic is not only power. Magic is status. Magic is destiny. In the candlelit halls of Netherese enclaves, knowledge was hoarded and traded like gold. Spells were guarded like borders. Rivalries formed between archwizards who were, in every practical sense, independent sovereigns. Each enclave a drifting realm, each mythaler its beating heart. Yet the Empire still held together, because beneath all the rivalries was a shared conviction. Netheril was the future of humanity. This conviction did not come from pride alone. It came from real achievement. The Netherese saw what they had built, and they compared it to the fragile kingdoms of other men. They compared it to the ancient empires of elves that had already withered. They compared it to dwarven holds that, for all their strength, were bound to stone. Netheril was not bound. Netheril moved. The art, to them, was not merely a tool. It was a promise that humanity could outrun history. But even at the height of this early ascent, something watched them. Not a god, not a dragon. Something older than Netherese ambition and more patient. Deep beneath the lands that would one day become Anauroch, there were beings for whom the rise of Netheril was not inspiring. It was alarming. Because they understood magic not as culture, but as ecology. A web of forces that can be overstressed, drained, broken. The Faerun. In the chronicles of Faerun, the Faerun are remembered as ancient, terrible arcanists in their own right. Creatures whose very existence is tied to magic, who wield it in ways that feel predatory rather than scholarly. Their conflict with Netheril would not begin as a clean war with banners and lines of soldiers. It began as pressure, as sabotage, as unseen strikes against the foundations that kept Netheril comfortable. And that is the first real turning point to understand. Netheril's greatest achievements made it vulnerable. A floating city cannot grow crops in the sky. It still depends on the land. A mythaler can provide power, but it also becomes a single point of failure. A society that worships the art becomes terrified of anything that threatens the art. Because if the art falters, everything collapses at once. So the first age of Netheril's greatness carried a quiet dread within it. They were rising fast. They were building wonders. They were shaping a civilization where spellcraft was as common as law. And somewhere below, something began to push back. Not with rage, with hunger. And in that pressure, The Netherese did what mortals often do when faced with an enemy that cannot be easily seen. They began to harden. They began to justify. They began to tell themselves that any step forward was worth it, because the alternative was fear. This is the earliest truth of Netheril, before its name becomes synonymous with catastrophe. The empire did not fall because it reached too high once. It fell because it trained itself, slowly and proudly, to believe there should be no such thing as too high. Netheril's greatness did not arrive like a coronation. It arrived like a habit, practiced until it felt inevitable. Once the first enclaves had proven that stone could be persuaded to ignore the pull of the world, the empire's future stopped being debated and started being assumed. A nation that can lift a city does not ask whether it should lead. It asks only how far leadership can extend before it meets resistance. And resistance did come. Quiet at first, like a crack traveling through ice. The Netherils quickly learned that floating above danger did not remove danger. It only changed where the danger gathered. Beneath every enclave lay territory that had to feed it, supply it, and protect the roots that tied the sky to the ground. Grain still had to be grown. Ore still had to be dug. Timber still had to be cut. The art could multiply comforts, but it could not erase dependence without replacing it with something worse. So the empire organized itself around a truth that most later tales forget. Netheril was not only arch-wizards in the clouds, it was also a vast scaffold of mortal labor and mortal vulnerability below. This is where the state truly began to harden into an empire. Ground cities expanded into planned centers, places where the flow of goods could be measured and controlled, where roads were maintained not for pilgrimage or pride, but for logistical necessity. Trade was no longer merely a way to survive winter. It became the bloodstream of a civilization that believed it had outgrown natural limits. And the art, always the art, became policy. A Netherese ruler did not need to be crowned if they could shape weather, defend borders with wards, or provide miracles that made rivals look primitive. In time, the arch-wizards who commanded the greatest enclaves became powers whose authority felt almost self-justifying. Their cities were not simply settlements. They were symbols. They were movable capitals. They were proof that the empire's hierarchy was written in the sky. Yet even as the empire's structure strengthened, a deeper change took place in the Netherese mind. Magic became normal. That sounds harmless until you understand the consequence. When magic becomes normal, it stops being sacred. It becomes a resource. And when magic becomes a resource, the first question is always the same. How do we get more? Netherese arcanists began to push their studies toward scale. Spell work that once served a household now served districts. Enchantments that once lasted a night were made to persist for seasons. They sought stability so complete that a citizen could forget they were living inside a miracle. And they achieved it, again and again. But every expansion of magical infrastructure pulled on threads that were not designed to be pulled so hard. The weave, though Netheril would not speak of it in the later reverent language of priests, was still the medium through which their wonders were made. It was not infinite. It was not a bottomless well. The Netherese did not begin by trying to break it. They began by trying to master it. Here, the chronicles split into the kind of detail that separates a legend from a civilization. Netheril's greatness was not only in spell books and towers, but in institutions. They built systems of learning, and those systems created generations of arcanists who did not see magic as rare inspiration, but as disciplined craft. They built libraries and academies where spells were refined like tools, where new formulae were tested, argued over, codified, improved. This is why Netheril seemed unstoppable. It produced power reliably, the way other realms produced grain, and with reliable power came reliable expansion. The North in those ages was not empty. It held peoples and territories, alliances and rivalries, older ruins and older claims. Yet Netheril's reach extended because it offered something that felt like inevitability. It could protect, it could enrich, it could punish. And it could do all of this without needing to march slow armies through snow. A ward laid across a pass can do what 1,000 soldiers cannot. A scrying spell can do what 100 scouts cannot. A single arch-wizard can terrify neighbors into treaties long before steel ever touches flesh. So Netheril's influence became a kind of atmospheric pressure, felt even by those who never saw an enclave overhead. But this expansion carried another hidden consequence. It increased the number of things that could go wrong. The more the empire depended on persistent magic, the more catastrophic any disruption became. If crops fail in an ordinary kingdom, people starve. If a mythalar falters in Netheril, a city falls out of the sky. If a ward fails on a border, enemies do not merely raid, they reach the heart. So Netheril's security became obsession. They layered protections on protections, built magical redundancies, created defensive networks that were as much engineering as sorcery. And in doing so, they drew even more deeply on the same currents that their enemies beneath the earth had always treated as prey. The Faerun did not appear to Netheril as a clear army at the gate. They were not the kind of enemy that announces itself with banners. In many accounts, their war against Netheril is remembered as a long, grinding struggle fought through sabotage, ambush, hidden assaults, and the draining of life from the land. The first symptoms were subtle. A harvest that should have been plentiful came in thin. Wells began to taste wrong. Beasts migrated earlier than they should have, as if fleeing something unseen. In remote regions, settlements went silent without leaving clean evidence of invasion. And when Netherese arcanists investigated, they did not find the kinds of threats they knew how to defeat. They found absence. They found emptiness where there should have been life. They found, in places, the marks of magic used like a weapon meant to starve the world itself. This was the mid-part anchor Netheril could not ignore. Their enemy was attacking the foundation. A floating empire still dies if the land beneath it becomes a corpse. So Netheril responded the only way it truly knew how, by escalating. They did not merely fight. They innovated in the act of fighting. They created spells meant not for duels, but for extermination. They pushed protective magic outward, laid wards over regions, reshaped territory to make it defensible. And in that escalation, the empire's moral center shifted. When the survival of your civilization depends on the art becomes justification for everything done in its name. Netherese archwizards, those who commanded enclaves and directed research, began to see limits as luxuries. Every restraint could be reframed as cowardice. Every warning could be dismissed as superstition. Because the Faerun did not merely threaten cities, they threatened the dream. And Netheril's dream was that humanity could transcend the old order. If the dream died, what was left? A cold land and ordinary lives, a return to weakness. So the empire chose to become harder rather than humbler. This is the point where Netheril's internal rivalries gained new sharpness. In an age of peace, archwizards can afford to indulge pride and eccentricity. In an age where invisible enemies are draining the world, pride becomes policy. An archwizard who can propose a new defense becomes indispensable. An archwizard who can propose a terrifying weapon becomes celebrated, and celebrated terrors have a way of outliving the threats that created them. In time, Netheril produced figures whose names still carry weight like stone. Ulium, often remembered as the first and greatest of Netherrace archwizards in many sources, stood as a symbol of vast, cold intellect and monumental magical accomplishment. Others rose with their own enclaves and their own schools of thought, each believing they held the best answer to the Empire's mounting pressure. Netheril became a realm where genius was currency, and currency always concentrates. Below the enclaves, the ground-bound cities felt the strain in a different way. They bore the burden of war's logistics. They watched the sky cities drift, beautiful and distant, while their own lives remained anchored to fields and roads. They benefited from Netheril's protections, yes, but they also lived with the knowledge that the true levers of the Empire were not in their hands. And when people feel protected but powerless, they begin to wonder whether the protection is love or control. So the Empire was caught between two fears: fear of the Faerun, an enemy that could starve the world; fear of fracture, an internal weakness that could unravel the whole structure. To answer both fears, Netheril leaned harder into what it understood: hierarchy enforced by magic. The archwizards consolidated authority. The enclaves became not only cities but instruments of governance, hovering over regions like watchful eyes. Magical law became as real as written law, and in the minds of those who ruled, the logic felt clean. If power preserves us, then more power is more preservation. It was a seductive equation. It sounded like responsibility. It was also the beginning of a lie. Because the same obsession that made Netheril resilient also made it reckless. Every innovation demanded deeper commitments. Every defense demanded stronger engines. Every escalation demanded new spells of greater scale, until the art itself began to feel less like a craft and more like a force that must be continually fed. And when a civilization begins to feed on power to remain itself, it becomes difficult to tell where defense ends and hunger begins. By the end of this period, Netheril had done something extraordinary. It had turned magic into the foundation of a human empire so vast and advanced that later ages would look back on it like a myth. Yet the truth was darker. Netheril was becoming an empire that could not slow down, because to slow down would mean to notice how much the ground beneath it was already changing, how the war beneath the earth was already draining the north, how the costs of constant magic were accumulating like unpaid debts. And the empire's greatest minds, its greatest builders, were starting to look beyond survival. They were starting to look toward transcendence. Not because the Faerun forced them to dream bigger, but because, after enough miracles, survival begins to feel too small for the kind of people who have taught themselves to ignore limits. By the time Netheril was spoken of as an empire rather than a region, it had already done something rarer than conquest. It had changed what humans believed they were allowed to be. In most realms, power sits on a throne and wears a name. In Netheril, power lived in laboratories, libraries, and spell vaults, measured in comprehension, guarded by discipline, and displayed in feats that turned common sense into a kind of poverty. A farmer might pray for rain. A Netherese arcanist could argue with the sky until it yielded. And so the Empire's first true currency was not gold. It was spellcraft. The Netherese did not merely produce wizards. They produced an entire class. Arcanists whose identity, status, and authority were fused to the art. In some tellings, the very word arcanist becomes synonymous with Netheril's mature age, an era when wizardry was no longer an eccentric vocation, but the expected path for anyone ambitious enough to climb. That climb was steep. Netheril's society stratified with an honesty that almost feels brutal. Those who could wield magic ruled. Those who could not became essential, laborers, craftspeople, traders, farmers, yet always beneath a ceiling made of invisible force. Even in cities blessed by enchantment, the air carried a quiet message. The empire is built by those who understand the art, and everyone else lives within the shape they decide. And still, it worked. For a time, it worked too well. Because Netheril's institutions made mastery reproducible. The art became teachable at scale, refined through academies, circles, and traditions that prized technique over superstition. The spellbook was not a personal diary anymore. It was an archive, a blueprint, a weapon. This is where the floating enclaves began to multiply, not merely as marvels, but as policy. Each enclave was a capital with its own interests, its own hierarchy, its own research obsessions. Some were brilliant and orderly, devoted to civic stability. Others were eccentric realms shaped by the temperament of the arch-wizard who commanded them. The empire endured that fragmentation because it had the one thing that united all Netherese ambition, a shared faith that the art was destiny. Yet destiny has a cost, and Netheril's cost was dependence, total, intimate, and irreversible. The Mythalar made enclaves possible, but it also made them hungry. A floating city is not simply stone held aloft. It is an entire civilization suspended by continuous magic, day after day, year after year. That kind of persistence demands power that does not sleep. So Netheril began to think in terms of engines, not metaphors, engines. The art was no longer only something you cast. It became something you maintained, something you fueled, something you engineered into the bones of society. In certain accounts, the great arch-wizards, figures like Ulam above all, are remembered not merely as spellcasters, but as architects of magical infrastructure, builders of systems designed to outlast ordinary lifetimes. And here is the small revelation that changes the texture of everything that came before. Netheril did not collapse because it was careless with a few spells. It built a world that required carelessness to continue. If the empire slowed its innovation, it risked falling behind its own needs. If it limited its ambition, it threatened the very structures that made Netherese life possible. A realm that lives inside miracles cannot easily return to the ordinary without feeling like it has been buried alive. So even as the Faerun war pressed from below the earth, draining, sabotaging, attacking the land itself, Netheril's response was not restraint. It was escalation, refined into doctrine. The war changed Netheril's research priorities. Spells were no longer developed merely to impress rivals or beautify cities. They were developed to control territory, defend supply lines, and hunt enemies that did not fight like armies. The Faerun were not simply invaders. They were a pressure against the land's vitality, a threat that could hollow the world beneath Netheril's feet. The Netherese answered with grand protections. Wards stretched across regions, magical defenses meant to shield entire settlements, not just a single keep. And the more they protected, the more the empire learned a new habit, solving problems at scale. This is the mid-part turning point that recasts Netheril's greatness into something more ominous. To save itself, Netheril began treating the world as a canvas rather than a home. When a realm decides that landscapes are variables, not inheritances, its imagination becomes terrifying. It starts to measure forests in terms of fuel, mountains in terms of ore, rivers in terms of control, people in terms of utility, even enemies in terms of resource, sources of knowledge to be exploited, threats to be studied, specimens to be understood. And because Netheril was brilliant, it often succeeded. Its defenses held longer than they should have. Its economy endured strain that would have broken lesser kingdoms. Its enclaves remained in the sky, drifting like immense crowns over a land that was increasingly treated as a foundation to be used, not a living partner to be respected. But inside the empire, another conflict grew, one that did not require Faerun to ignite it. The conflict between unity and sovereignty. Each enclave was a realm in miniature. Each archwizard was, in practice, a ruler with the power to enforce law by force of spell, to withdraw support, to hoard discoveries, to make alliances that benefited their own domain first. Netheril's empire, from a distance, looked like one titanic structure. Up close, it was a web of egos held together by mutual dependence and shared fear. And fear is a poor mortar. As the war continued, prestige began to shift toward those who could produce the greatest results fastest. The pressure rewarded risk. It rewarded the creation of spells that pushed boundaries, magic that older races would have treated with suspicion, magic that relied on principles so advanced that even many Netherese citizens could only accept them as authority, not understanding. This is where Netheril's most dangerous legacy begins to show itself in full: the pursuit of magic beyond the accepted limits. In later ages, most mortal spellcasting would be bounded by laws imposed on the art itself. Netheril lived before those limits hardened into the shape modern Faerun knows. The Empire's greatest arcanists explored magic of staggering magnitude, spells spoken of in canon as 10th level and beyond, workings that exceeded what later generations would consider possible or permissible. These were not parlor tricks, they were statements of philosophy. Proof that impossible was merely a word for people who had not yet learned the right formula. And as those formulas grew, so did a quiet arrogance that no victory could satisfy. Because once you can reshape weather, float cities, and bind continuous power into an artifact, the mind starts to wander toward larger targets. Survival becomes boring. Security becomes assumed. The greatest arcanists begin to look at the gods, not with worship, but with appraisal. Netheril did not need to declare that openly for the shift to be real. It was present in priorities, in language, in the way archwizards spoke of the art as if it were the highest principle in existence, and everything else, kingdoms, traditions, even divine commandments, were lesser frameworks that could be revised. Yet even within Netheril, this was not a single voice. Some sought stability, control, and long endurance. Others sought transformation so absolute that it would make every earlier triumph look like a child's illusion. The Empire became an argument conducted in spells, an argument about what humanity should become when it no longer accepts a ceiling. And the tragedy is that Netheril's greatest achievements were real. The comfort it brought was real. The knowledge it created was real. The brilliance was not a lie. But the Empire's brilliance trained it to believe that the world would always yield to intellect, that consequences could always be calculated, that no force, mortal or divine, could truly deny a civilization that had made itself synonymous with magic. Netheril's mature age, then, is best understood not as a single shining peak, but as a transformation of belief. A human empire taught itself that power was not a means. Power was the point. And once that belief takes root, Every miracle becomes less like a gift, and more like a demand the universe is expected to fulfill. When the enclaves became common enough to be recognized by their silhouettes alone, Netheril stopped feeling like a kingdom and started feeling like a law of nature. A law written in altitude. From the ground, the sky cities looked serene, stone islands drifting in slow authority, lantern light glimmering at dusk, gardens improbably green above winter-gray land. From within, they were not serene at all. They were machines of governance, engines of research, and symbols of a society that had decided the earth was something you could outgrow. In the Empire's mature age, Netheril functioned in two worlds at once. There was the realm below, farms, roads, mines, caravans, and the ordinary human labor that no spell ever truly erased. This was the Netheril that sweated and bled, the Netheril that felt hunger first when a harvest failed or a trade route went silent. And then there was the realm above, High Netheril, the drifting dominions of archwizards who lived close to their own miracles, where civic life was shaped by enchantment so constant that it could be mistaken for weather. That division was not merely social, it was psychological. People who walk the same streets as everyone else learn compromise. People who can lift their streets away from everyone else learn something colder. Netheril's greatness came from organization as much as invention. Magic did not remain a private art. It was pulled into administration. Spellcasting became a civic tool to secure borders, to enforce law, to build and repair, to communicate over distances that would have broken slower realms. In many places, the Empire felt efficient in a way that frightened its neighbors, an order maintained not by slow negotiation, but by wards that did not get tired, and by watchers who needed no sleep. And here is a truth that often surprises those who only know Netheril as a cautionary tale. For many Netherese citizens, life improved, not for all, not equally, but enough that loyalty could feel rational. Roads were safer under magical protections. Towns could recover from disaster faster than any ordinary settlement. Disease and famine did not vanish, but they were challenged, resisted, pushed back by skill that other peoples could not match. The Empire's pride was not built on illusion. It was built on real, lived advantage. That advantage, however, demanded a price in obedience, because a society that runs on the art must be directed by those who possess it. So Netheril's hierarchy sharpened. Those who could wield magic rose into authority almost automatically, and those who could not learned to live inside structures they did not understand. It was not always cruelty. Often it was simply certainty. When the stakes are survival, people surrender power to whoever can keep the lights on, but survival was no longer the only stake. By this point, Netheril's expansion was not only territorial, it was conceptual. It began to treat neighboring realms, rival tribes, and even older ruins as parts of a broader system the Empire had the right to manage. Where others negotiated borders, Netheril negotiated outcomes. A treaty was not an agreement between equals. It was a spell of politics, crafted so that the weaker party could feel honored while being contained. And each success made the next demand easier. As enclaves multiplied, so did the archwizards who commanded them, each a sovereign in practice, each capable of shaping local reality through spell and decree. This created a contradiction at the heart of Netheril. It was an empire, but it was also a constellation of competing powers. A lesser kingdom would have fractured under that strain. Netheril endured because the art made fragmentation survivable. An archwizard could rule their portion of the empire like a private realm, yet still benefit from the wider network of Netherese trade, research, and defense. The empire became a web, each strand tugging against the others, none willing to snap the whole thing because all profited from its tension. That arrangement felt stable until the Faerun forced the cost of stability into the open. The war beneath the earth was not a single battle to be won. It was attrition against the land itself. The Faerun attacked what the enclaves could not float away from: the farms, the water, the living foundation that kept the empire fed and supplied. They were enemies whose magic did not merely kill, it unmade, and the empire learned a brutal lesson. A floating city is only as immortal as the fields beneath it. So Netheril responded with measures that changed its character. Defensive wards expanded, not just around enclaves, but across regions. Magical patrols became routine. Investigations into the enemy's nature became relentless, because the Faerun could not be fought like ordinary foes. Every time Netheril adapted, it did so by reaching deeper into the art, demanding more power, more persistence, more certainty. This was the mid-part turning point that hardened Netheril's fate. The Empire began to treat the art not as a practice, but as a necessity that justified anything. Once that belief took hold, restraint looked like betrayal. Caution looked like weakness. A spell that would have once seemed unthinkable could be rebranded as required. The moral argument was simple and deadly. If we do not do this, we will die. And because Netheril was brilliant, it could always find a way to make the unthinkable work, at least for a while. But working is not the same as being safe. Within Netheril's circles of power, rivalry shifted from prestige to urgency. Discoveries were no longer only trophies, they were leverage. The archwizard who could produce a new ward, a new method, a new engine of power became indispensable. And indispensability is its own form of rule. In that climate, the greatest minds began to drift toward an idea that would poison the Empire's judgment. That the limits others feared were merely limits that had not yet been solved. The Netherils had already proven the ground could be denied. They had proven magic could be made continuous. They had proven that mortal lifespans did not prevent mortal greatness. So the Empire's elites began to look at the structure of reality itself with the same cold confidence they once reserved for stone and weather. The weave was no longer simply the medium of spellcraft. It became a resource to be engineered, a fabric to be pulled tighter, made stronger, made more compliant. Maestril, the goddess of magic in that age, remained acknowledged, but not in the humble manner of worshippers. In the Netherese mind, divinity was increasingly treated as a feature of the cosmos, rather than a sovereign authority. The Empire's most ambitious arcanists did not ask what the gods permitted. They asked what the gods had managed to monopolize. And still, on the ground, ordinary Netherese citizens went on living. They traded, worked, raised children, took shelter under protections they could not name. Many likely believed the Empire would endure forever, because the sky itself seemed to carry their civilization. That is what makes Netheril's mature age so haunting. It was not a realm teetering visibly on collapse. It was a realm functioning at such a high level that collapse felt impossible. The daily rhythm of miracles creates a false sense of permanence. When your streets are held aloft by an artifact heart that never sleeps, you begin to believe permanence is something you have earned. In truth, Netheril had earned something else. It had earned complexity, so vast, so dependent on constant magical success, that failure could no longer be localized. A mistake in a single spell no longer meant a burned hand or a shattered room. In Netheril, mistakes could become geography. They could become famine. They could become the fall of a city. So the empire marched forward with a calm face and a sharpening hunger, convinced that progress was protection, convinced that mastery was morality. It did not see itself as reckless. It saw itself as responsible for maintaining the only civilization strong enough to stand above fear. And by the end of this phase of its greatness, Netheril had achieved its most dangerous accomplishment of all. It had made its people believe that power was not merely something they used. Power was something they were entitled to. War arrived in Netheril the way rot arrives in a beam, quietly, then all at once, when the weight finally tests what has been hollowed. At first, the Faerun were a rumor with consequences, a border settlement that stopped sending caravans, a farming basin that produced less grain than its own weather could explain, a river that ran low in a season when it should have been fat with meltwater. The empire sent arcanists to look, and those arcanists returned with reports that did not sound like ordinary enemy action. They spoke of absence, not burnt fields, not pillaged storehouses, not bodies, just land that felt thinned, as if something had been drinking the world, leaving matter behind but stealing vigor from it. Even the air, in those early accounts, is described as wrong, too still, too dry, too unwilling to carry scent. Netheril could endure many threats. It could not endure that one. Because Netheril's greatest miracle, its sky-born civilization, still ate what grew on the ground. So the empire hunted an enemy it could not reliably see. And to do that, it leaned into the art with a focus that reshaped everything. Divinations became routine across entire regions. Wards were laid like nets. Patrols were no longer only soldiers. They were spellcasters trained to read subtle disturbances in magical currents, to recognize the footprint of life being siphoned away. The Faerun were not treated like raiders. They were treated like a disease. That framing mattered. It allowed measures that would have once seemed monstrous to be described as sanitation. Small revelations began to change the empire's tone. Netheril's mages discovered that the Faerun were not merely killing, they were feeding. Their workings did not only destroy crops, they drained the vitality that makes crops possible. And the more Netheril studied them, the more horrifying the implication became. This enemy's relationship to magic was not scholarly, it was predatory. Netheril responded with predation of its own, not in the same form, but in the same spirit. The empire's spells became larger, harsher, more permanent. Protecting farmland was no longer a matter of a few weather charms or localized blessings. Netheril began anchoring wide-area workings meant to preserve fertility, hold moisture, stabilize seasons, and prevent the slow bleed of life the Faerun inflicted. In some traditions, these defensive measures are remembered as the first time Netheril truly attempted to treat entire landscapes as a spell that could be maintained. It worked, and because it worked, it became necessary. Here is the turning point. Quiet enough to miss if you only listen for explosions. Netheril's defense of the land became another engine that demanded fuel. Sustaining great regional protections required constant magical attention. The Empire's mythalars could empower enclaves, yes, but the Empire also needed the ground to remain productive, and so the art was poured back into the soil again and again. The more the Faerun drained, the more Netheril reinforced. The more Netheril reinforced, the more the Empire's survival became dependent on continuous, large-scale spell work. A kingdom can endure war and still return to peace. A civilization built on persistent miracles cannot return to anything. As this cycle hardened, Netheril's internal structure changed. Enclaves drifted into more strategic patterns. not merely hovering over prestige territories, but over supply arteries, fertile basins, and choke points where disruption would be catastrophic. Archwizards negotiated not just for honor, but for resources, access to the best ground support networks, the most stable trade routes, the safest sources of mundane production. And when an enclave's prosperity depends on the land beneath it, control becomes a kind of hunger. So the ground-bound Netherese felt the empire press down on them even as the sky cities floated above. Taxes, requisitions, and labor demands grew sharper. Protection came with strings. Wards that defended a town could also watch it. The art that kept the wolves out could also keep the citizens in. Netheril told itself this was unity. In practice, it was consolidation. The Faerun War also forced Netheril to confront a hard fact about its own genius. Not all problems yield to brilliance quickly enough. The enemy was ancient, patient. It did not need to win a single decisive battle. It only needed to keep draining, year after year, until the empire's foundation collapsed under its own weight. So Netheril's greatest minds began making decisions that treated time as the real battlefield. They looked for solutions that would end the war rather than manage it. This is where the empire's moral corrosion becomes visible in its research priorities. The Netherese explored spells designed not merely to repel an enemy, but to scour it. Magic meant to hunt in darkness, to penetrate underground defenses, to kill things that hid where ordinary armies could not reach. In an empire where archwizards already competed for prestige, war transformed prestige into urgency. Whoever could deliver a decisive advantage could demand anything, and the empire rewarded that behavior. Because fear rewards the same qualities that pride does, only faster. Netheril's citizens, many of whom never saw a Faerun, lived inside the consequences anyway. The land became less reliable. Regions that had been stable began to fluctuate. Some areas recovered after magical reinforcement. Others never truly did. The empire's chroniclers and administrators began to note changes that no spell fully reversed. The spread of arid stretches, the stubborn failure of certain soils, the way some valleys seemed to lose their old softness. In later ages, those signs would be understood as early shadows of what the heartland would become. But in Netheril's time, the prevailing belief was that the art could always catch up, because it always had. That belief was not irrational. It was informed by centuries of success. But it carried a hidden flaw that the war was exposing day by day. Success had trained Netheril to ignore the possibility that some victories create conditions where the next victory must be larger, and the one after that larger still. The empire was building a staircase where each step cost more than the last. So the Faerun War became more than a struggle for land. It became a struggle over the meaning of mastery. Was the art a tool to preserve civilization, even if it required harsh control and relentless escalation? Or was the art becoming a furnace Netheril had to feed with ever greater measures, until preservation and consumption looked the same from a distance? By the end of this chapter of Netheril's rise, one truth had settled into place like stone. The empire was no longer merely using magic to defend itself. It was reorganizing life, soil, law, labor, and belief, around the assumption that only constant, expanding power could keep the world from being drained dry. Netheril did not fracture with a scream. It fractured with decisions that sounded reasonable. A war that drains the land teaches an empire to think in extremes. The Faerun did not merely threaten towns and caravans. They threatened the one thing the enclaves could never levitate away from, the living foundation that fed them. So the Netherese response kept expanding. Broader wards, harsher counterspells, deeper divinations, and protections layered until whole regions felt like they were wrapped in invisible glass. For a time, the measures held. That made them holy. And once a method is treated as holy, anyone who challenges it becomes dangerous, no matter how sensible their warning might be. Inside the Sky Cities, the politics of survival turned archwizards into rival sovereigns with a shared addiction. Each enclave had its own council, its own spell vaults, its own traditions. Each had reasons to cooperate and reasons to withhold. In peacetime, that rivalry was ornament, prestige, competition, bragging rights carved into stone and sigil. Under pressure, rivalry becomes something sharper. Because in Netheril, knowledge was not merely pride. Knowledge was protection. A ward formula that could preserve crops in a draining valley could save a city from hunger. A new detection spell that could expose a hidden Faerun incursion could spare a region from collapse. Even small advancements became currency, and currency concentrates in hands that already possess power. So the Empire's internal rhythm changed. It began to reward not wisdom, but results. It began to forgive cruelty if cruelty worked. It began to treat restraint as an unaffordable luxury. And as that logic spread, it created two Netherils living in the same sky. One Netheril still spoke the language of stewardship. Preserve the Empire, preserve the land, preserve the human future that Netheril had promised. The other Netheril spoke the language of inevitability. If the art can do it, it will be done. Because the Empire cannot afford to leave power unused. Those two voices were not aligned by morality. They were aligned by temperament. And the greatest arcanists of the age became symbols of that divide. Eulom, named in canon as one of Netheril's most towering arch-wizards, represented the Empire at its coldest and most enduring. His reputation, across sources, rests not on a single spectacle, but on magnitude, the kind of mind that builds systems and expects them to last, the kind of architect who thinks in centuries while others think in seasons. Under his shadow, Netheril's power looks less like fireworks and more like architecture, structured, reinforced, made to carry enormous weight. Yet the weight was still increasing. In other enclaves, younger archwizards rose who were not satisfied with architecture alone. They did not want to maintain the miracle. They wanted to surpass it. They looked at the Faerun War and saw more than an enemy beneath the earth. They saw proof that the world still had the power to say no, and that was intolerable. This was the small but essential revelation spreading through Netheril's elite. The Empire's true vulnerability was not the Faerun. It was dependence. Netheril had built a civilization that required constant magical success. If the art faltered, everything fell. Not only cities, but identity. So certain minds began to search for an answer that would not merely defeat an enemy, but abolish vulnerability itself. In the colleges and private sanctums of the enclaves, magic climbed into realms that later ages would call forbidden, not because they were immoral, but because they were too large. Netheril's arcanists pursued spells beyond the limits that would later define mortal spellcasting. Workings of such scale that they turned the idea of acceptable risk into something almost quaint. And because the Empire needed hope, it praised those who offered impossible solutions. That praise created a new kind of authority, charisma built from brilliance. And in that climate, Karsus rose. Karsus is not remembered in Netheril's story as a general or a king. He is remembered as a spellcaster whose ambition had a clean, almost mathematical shape. A prodigy whose confidence did not come from drunken pride, but from mastery. In an empire that valued capability above blood, that mattered more than any pedigree, he belonged to the age that believed the weave could be engineered. He belonged to the age that treated gods as part of the cosmos rather than rulers of it. His rise was not an accident. Netheril was a realm that promoted those who could deliver. And Karsus delivered advancements, insights, and the kind of force of mind that made older archwizards pay attention, even when they did not wish to. Where Iulim's greatness suggested endurance, Karsus's greatness suggested escape. Escape from reliance. Escape from limitation. Escape from the humiliating truth that even Netheril's sky could still be threatened by something crawling in the dark. Here, in the middle of Netheril's greatest age, the Empire encountered its most dangerous turning point. It began to confuse the survival of the realm with the expansion of the art. Once those two ideas fused, every step toward greater power could be justified as a public duty. A spell that elevated one archwizard's prestige could be framed as a necessary deterrent. A risky working that once would have been condemned could be defended as the only responsible path forward. The Empire did not need a tyrant to corrupt it. It only needed a shared fear and a shared pride. So the factions sharpened, not always as declared parties, but as patterns of choice. Some archwizards tightened control over their enclaves, investing in defensive redundancies, strengthening civic enchantments, preserving stability at all costs. Others pushed the boundaries, testing spells of unprecedented reach, seeking shortcuts to invulnerability, exploring principles that treated the weave like a reservoir to be tapped harder and harder. Both sides believed they were saving Netheril. Both sides were feeding the same hunger. And beneath it all, the war continued to drain the land in stubborn silence. Every year that passed without decisive victory made the extremists sound more persuasive. Every region that faltered made caution sound naive. The Empire had built itself into a corner of its own brilliance. It could not retreat without losing the identity that held it together, and it could not stop escalating without admitting that escalation had become its lifeblood. So the greatest minds of Netheril became mirrors of its fate. Iulim, the architect, embodied the impulse to preserve, through structure, control, and endurance. Karsus, the prodigy, embodied the impulse to transcend, through a leap so vast that it would render enemies, limits, even divine hierarchy into mere obstacles to be solved. Netheril still looked invincible from below. Enclaves still drifted like slow-moving stars. Markets still opened. Roads still carried trade. Spells still lit streets and strengthened walls. But the Empire's inner story had changed. It was no longer asking how to survive. It was asking what price was acceptable to ensure that nothing, no enemy beneath the earth, no law of magic, no divine boundary, could ever threaten it again. Netheril's final gamble did not begin with madness. It began with a calculation. For centuries, the Empire had trained itself to treat every boundary as temporary. Winter was a boundary until it wasn't. Distance was a boundary until it wasn't. Hunger was a boundary until a spell made it negotiable. Even gravity became a disagreement Netheril could win. So when the Faerun War proved that power could still be threatened, the Empire's brightest minds did not conclude that the dream was flawed. They concluded that the dream had not yet gone far enough. Karsus understood the Empire's weakness with a clarity that frightened older archwizards. Netheril's greatness, its enclaves, its mythalars, its wards stretched across entire regions, was still dependent on one underlying truth. Magic itself had a foundation the Netherese did not control. They could shape the art, but they did not own the medium that made it possible. A realm built on miracles is not truly sovereign if the source of miracles belongs to someone else. That is where Karsus aimed his ambition, not at a rival enclave or a hidden enemy beneath the earth, but at the very principle of limitation. In Netheril's mature age, the goddess of magic was Mistral. To most mortals, divinity is a distant terror or a distant comfort. To Netheril's elite, divinity had become something else, a monopoly, a cosmic authority that determined the rules of the art. And Netheril had spent its entire history proving that rules could be rewritten. The Empire's scholars could have chosen humility in the face of that truth. Karsus chose ownership. He set out to craft a spell unlike anything mortal hands had ever contained. Karsus's avatar. Not a prayer, not a bargain, a taking, designed to seize a god's power and place it within a mortal vessel. Even among Netheril's archwizards, this was not a casual endeavor. The spell was colossal in scope, requiring preparations that were more than academic. It demanded rare components, immense reservoirs of power, and a precision of theory so absolute that a single misalignment could ruin everything. The art was not being used to lift a city or scorch an army. It was being used to rewrite the chain that linked magic to divinity. Here, the first unsettling revelation becomes unavoidable. Karsus's ambition was not merely personal. It was a product of Netheril's culture. An empire that teaches that mastery is destiny will eventually produce someone who believes destiny includes the gods. In that sense, Karsus was less an aberration and more a culmination. What happens when brilliance grows up inside a civilization that treats limits as insults? In the halls of the enclaves, reactions were not uniform. Some archwizards recoiled, others watched in private dread. Others, quietly, were intrigued, because even if they feared the attempt, they also felt its seductive logic. If Netheril could control the foundation of magic, then every other threat became secondary. The Faerun would become manageable. The Empire's dependence on fragile land would lessen. The very idea of collapse could be denied. The spell promised an end to vulnerability. And that promise is how civilizations talk themselves into disaster. Around the middle of this chapter of Netheril's story is the moment that redefines everything that came before. Karsus did not seek divinity because he felt invincible. He sought it because the Empire, for all its splendor, had begun to feel afraid. Fear in Netheril did not look like panic. It looked like urgency. It looked like an intolerance for delay. It looked like the quiet conviction that if a solution existed, it had to be forced into being, no matter the risk, because the alternative was admitting that even Netheril could be cornered. That fear sharpened the spell from a theory into an act. When Karsus prepared to cast, Netheril stood at its highest point in human memory. Enclaves drifted above the world like crowns of stone and light. Mythalars beat steadily, feeding wards, streets, and institutions. Citizens walked beneath floating wonders and believed the empire had become permanent. And in a sense, it had. Permanent in confidence, permanent in habit. The casting of Karsus's avatar was not a private ritual conducted in a forgotten cellar. It was the kind of event that a civilization like Netheril could not keep truly hidden, because too many systems had to be aligned, too much power had to be drawn, too much preparation had to be executed across networks of knowledge and influence. The air itself, by many accounts, would have felt wrong in those hours, charged, tense, as if the world anticipated a change it could not name. Even people who did not understand the spell would have felt the pressure of an empire holding its breath. And then the spell was spoken. In that moment, Karsus reached into the structure of the art and seized at the divine heart behind it. He targeted Mistral, not as a worshipper, but as a technician reaching for a control lever. For an instant, it worked. That is the second revelation, and it is the cruelest. The impossible was not impossible. Karsus touched divinity. He forced a transfer that mortals were never meant to survive, and in doing so, he struck the weave like a hammer strikes glass. The goddess of magic, source and regulator of the art, could not simply be replaced like a crown passed between kings. The weave was not a throne. It was a living structure, bound to Mistral's nature. As Karsus took hold, the foundation of spellcasting shuddered. Not in metaphor, in reality. Magic faltered, not in distant corners, but everywhere at once, because the medium through which Netheril lived had been destabilized at the highest level. The empire that had made itself synonymous with the art experienced a truth it had trained itself not to imagine. The art could fail. And when the art fails in Netheril, everything the empire has built becomes suddenly honest. The sky cities are no longer divine. They are heavy. Wards are no longer eternal. They are temporary. Enchantments are no longer the background hum of civilization. They are fragile threads that can snap. Karsus's spell revealed, in a single heartbeat, what Netheril had refused to admit for centuries. The Empire's miracles were not proof of independence. They were proof of dependence, total, absolute, and shared. And in that instant, Netheril's greatest achievement turned into its clearest confession. The moment it tried to own magic itself, it proved that it had never truly understood what it was holding. When the weave buckled, it did not do so politely. It did not fail like a lamp going out in one room. It failed like a spine failing in a giant body, suddenly, everywhere, and with consequences that could not be isolated. Netheril had built a civilization that assumed magic was as reliable as stone. The mythalars that powered the enclaves were not decorative wonders. They were the heartbeats that kept cities suspended, the engines that fed civic enchantments, the invisible scaffolding beneath daily life. The Empire's roads, defenses, communications, even its sense of self, everything depended on the art behaving. So when Karsus seized Mistral's power, even briefly, the art stuttered. And in that stutter, the sky remembered gravity. This is the moment later ages name with reverence and fear, Karsus's folly. But to understand why it destroyed an empire, you have to feel how swift the transition was. One breath, Netheril is a realm above the world. The next, it is a realm falling into it. Magic that had been continuous became intermittent. Spellwork that held steady for years flickered. Wards unraveled like cloth cut by a blade. Enchantments that citizens had never thought to question simply ceased. And the enclaves, those immense cities of stone, began to drop. Not all in the same way, not all at once, but with inevitability. A city can drift only as long as the force holding it aloft continues. When that force falters, the city becomes what it always was beneath the miracle. Weight. To those on the ground, the sight would have been beyond terror. A mountain of architecture descending from the clouds, not as a controlled landing, but as catastrophe. There would have been no time to negotiate with that kind of falling. No army can intercept it. No wall can resist it. The only defense is distance, and most people do not outrun the sky. This is the first brutal truth of Netheril's collapse. The Empire did not lose a war. It lost its foundation. The weave's failure, even momentary, made every miracle simultaneously vulnerable. And because Netheril had multiplied miracles until they were infrastructure, the failure became total. Yet Netheril's end was not only mechanical, it was divine. Maestril, the goddess of magic in that age, did not die in the ordinary sense. The canon thread that remains consistent is that she sacrificed herself to repair what was breaking, an act that prevented the weave from collapsing entirely. It was not mercy toward Netheril alone. It was the preservation of magic as a cosmic principle. Because without that principle, the world would not simply lose spells, it would lose a fundamental structure of reality. In dying, Mistral became something else, Maestra, and that transformation carried a verdict Netheril could not appeal. The restored weave came back with limits, not as a punishment written in anger, but as a safeguard written in necessity. Magic of the extreme heights Netheril had pursued, those workings later described as beyond ninth-level spellcasting, would no longer be accessible to mortals in the same way. The new order of magic would be bounded, restrained, made less capable of shattering itself. This was the mid-part anchor that redefines Netheril's fall from disaster into epoch. Netheril's collapse changed the rules of magic for the entire world. That is why Netheril is remembered. Not because it was the largest empire, not because it lasted the longest, but because its death became a hinge in Faerun's history. The world after Netheril was not simply a world with ruins. It was a world where the art itself had been rewritten to prevent another Karsus, and yet the human cost did not wait for philosophy. As the weave stabilized under the new Mistra, the enclaves still fell. Some struck the earth and shattered into fields of ruin that would be picked through by scavengers and scholars for millennia. Others broke apart in the air, raining stone and fire in wide arcs. Where an enclave descended over inhabited territory, it did not merely kill, it erased, turning towns into debris, forests into scars, and rivers into choked channels. High Netheril, the sky-born symbol of human transcendence, became a grave. And beneath the wreckage, the ground-bound Netheries faced an end that was slower, but no less absolute. The Empire's protections were gone or unstable, its logistical networks shattered, its leadership, those arch-wizards who had governed from above, were dead, missing, or suddenly reduced to mortals scrambling for survival. A realm that runs on infrastructure can endure the death of a ruler. A realm that runs on magic cannot endure the death of magic, even briefly, without becoming something else. So Netheril became something else. In the chaos, the Faerun did not vanish. The war that had been pressing the land continued to matter, and in some accounts, it becomes even more ruinous in the aftermath, because the defenses that had held their draining at bay were shattered. Regions already strained began to dry. Soil that had been propped up by constant enchantment no longer had that support. The slow theft of life accelerated, and the landscape began its long shift toward what later ages would recognize as a desert heartland. In time, Anauroch would be named and feared, but in these first years, it was simply the Empire's corpse being stripped of moisture and memory. Netheril's survivors, those who lived through falling cities and failing wards, were left with a wound deeper than loss of territory. They were left with the collapse of certainty. The art had been their identity, their pride, their promise of human greatness. And in one act of ambition, that promise had detonated. This is why the story does not feel like a simple cautionary tale, because the fall was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by mastery without humility. Netheril's greatest minds did not misunderstand magic as a craft. They misunderstood it as something that could be owned. And when the new maestra rewrote the weave, the empire's ruins became a message carved into the world itself. There are heights mortals can reach, and then there is the moment when reaching becomes taking. Netheril reached, then it took, and the sky answered by letting go. After the fall, the world did not feel quieter. It felt exposed. For generations, Netheril's presence had been like a ceiling over the north, an unseen certainty that something vast, organized, and arcane stood above ordinary fate. Even those who resented the enclaves had lived under the assumption that the Empire's magic would continue humming, that wards would keep roads passable, that trained arcanists would respond when the land went wrong. Then the humming stopped. And the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the sound of systems collapsing, trade routes breaking, granaries emptying, protections fading, authority vanishing. A realm built on constant magic does not transition smoothly into a realm without it. It shatters into fragments that cannot all be saved. The survivors of Netheril faced an ugly truth. Their civilization had not merely lost its leaders, it had lost its operating principles. The new limits woven into the weave meant that the kind of spellcraft that had sustained their wonders could not simply be resumed. Even the most gifted arcanists who lived through the catastrophe found that the art they had known was altered, not merely weakened, but reshaped into a different relationship between mortal will and magical possibility. They were not only refugees, they were a people who had been demoted by reality itself. On the ground, communities became desperate. Some turned to remaining spellcasters as saviors, begging them to restore what had been lost. Others turned on them, blaming all wizards for the fall. In regions where enclaves had crashed, the land became cursed by wreckage, shattered stone, twisted enchantments, pockets of lingering magic behaving unpredictably, as if the ruins still remembered the moment the weave stuttered. The Empire's great libraries, once guarded like temples, became prizes, not only for knowledge, but for survival. If you could salvage a spell book, a cache of scrolls, a magical tool that still functioned under the new order, you could buy protection, food, allegiance. Netheril's legacy turned into currency scattered through rubble. And as always, when a civilization collapses, the scavengers arrive before the scholars. Relic hunters, warlords, surviving arcanists, and opportunists began to pick through Netheril's bones. Some sought to preserve what they could. Others sought only to profit. But even the most cynical among them could not escape the underlying dread. Netheril's ruins were not ordinary ruins. They were saturated with the residue of a world that had been running on magic at a scale the new weave no longer permitted. Which meant the ruins were not only valuable, they were dangerous. Here, a small but essential truth emerges that later ages often miss. Netheril did not die cleanly. Its body kept twitching. In the wreckage of fallen enclaves, artifacts still pulsed with power. Mythalars, in many tales, did not simply vanish. Their remnants became objects of obsession because they represented the old way, continuous magical power, the heart of the sky cities. Even broken, even unstable, such engines could tempt the ambitious into trying to rebuild something Netheril had lost the right to sustain. But the world around those ruins was changing in a slower, more merciless way. The land itself began to fail. The Faerun had been draining the north long before Karsus cast his spell. Netheril's defenses had held some of that damage at bay through constant reinforcement. After the fall, that reinforcement was gone. The enemy beneath the earth did not need to conquer a capital anymore. The capital had already fallen. So the draining continued. Valleys that once held dependable fertility turned brittle. Water sources became less reliable. Forests thinned. Some rivers changed behavior, not because nature had altered by chance, but because life had been steadily siphoned away from the region's ability to sustain itself. The process was not dramatic like a burning city, but it was more final. A slow transformation of a heartland into a place that could not easily support the kind of dense civilization Netheril had built. This is the mid-part anchor that changes the meaning of a Narok. The desert was not merely a natural feature, it was a consequence. Over time, the spread of aridity became part of the region's identity. Later, Faerun would name this wasteland a Narok, and the name would carry the weight of what had been lost. But in the years immediately after Netheril's collapse, people did not think in terms of future deserts. They thought in terms of present hunger, present scarcity, present fear. And fear does not produce wise societies. It produces harsh ones. In scattered pockets, Netherese survivors tried to recreate order. Some formed smaller states or enclaves of learning, guarded by whatever magic still functioned. Others fled south or west, carrying stories of falling cities like nightmares that would outlive them. Some turned inward and bitter, convinced that the world itself had betrayed them, that the gods had punished them unjustly. Yet even in this ruin, Netheril's shadow remained active, because not all Netherese power died in the fall. Certain archwizards had prepared in ways that ordinary citizens never understood. Some had taken paths that blurred the line between life and undeath. Liches, those who refused mortality through forbidden methods, are woven into the wider lore of Faerûn, and Netheril's age produced minds arrogant enough to pursue that escape. For such beings, the fall of the Empire was not the end of their story. It was a shift in the playing field. They became custodians of memory, or hoarders of it, and memory, in Faerûn, can be a weapon. Meanwhile, in distant lands, the lesson of Netheril settled into the bones of magical culture. The new limits on spellcasting were not merely theoretical. The world's greatest spellcasters learned, one by one, that the ceiling had lowered, and that it was not negotiable. Netheril's legacy became a warning built into the rules of reality. The art is vast, but it is not safely infinite. In the north, that lesson was written not in books, but in geography and grief. Ruins rose like broken teeth from the sand and scrub. Shattered stones still carried sigils whose meanings were half lost. The names of enclaves became legends. The Nether Scrolls, those first accelerants of human ambition, remained a haunting presence in the broader lore, because they represented the beginning. The moment mortals acquired a key to doors they did not fully understand. And every relic recovered from Netheril's corpse carried the same double message. Yes, humans once built this, and yes, humans paid for it. By the end of this period, Netheril was no longer an empire. It was an inheritance no one could safely accept. The land was failing. The ruins were dangerous. The old art was gone. The survivors were scattered. And yet the memory of the sky cities still hovered over Faerun like a temptation. If it was done once, could it be done again? That question would outlive everyone who first asked it. Netheril's story ends the way great empires rarely end. Not with a new banner raised over the ruins, with a lingering influence that refuses to stay buried. In the centuries after the fall, people learned to speak of Netheril the way they speak of dragons, with awe that borders on fear, and fear that sometimes disguises itself as admiration. The empire's stones became relics, its sigils became riddles, its spellcraft became the unreachable standard against which later wizardry measured itself and felt smaller. And yet, the most unsettling truth is that Netheril did not vanish from Faerun's history. It sank into it. The ruins and the lands that became Anauroch were not quiet, passive remains. They were saturated with old magic, some inert, some unstable, some behaving like a dream that refuses to end. Each century that passed did not erase Netheril's shadow. It distributed it. Relics were uncovered, stolen, studied, traded, hidden again. Spellbooks surfaced in unexpected places. Vaults were opened by hands that did not deserve what they found. And always, behind those discoveries, lingered the Empire's original temptation. Power once achieved feels like power owed. That temptation did not die with Karsus. It simply learned to wait for new minds. Netheril's greatest legacy was not a particular spell, not even the Mythalar or the floating enclave. Those were symptoms. The true legacy was the idea that a mortal civilization could treat reality as a draft, revise it, and call the revision progress. In the aftermath of Karsus's folly, Mystra's new weave imposed limits that shaped all later spellcasting. To the wider world, those limits became the invisible frame around magical life. To those who studied Netheril, they felt like an insult, like a door slammed shut, like a punishment that did not merely prevent disaster, but prevented greatness. So Netheril's memory became divisive. To priests and cautious sages, it was proof that arrogance invites collapse. To ambitious arcanists, it was proof that greatness was possible, and that something, whether gods or rules or fear, had stolen that possibility away. That division is why Netheril remains a living wound in the lore of Faerûn. It is not only an ancient empire, it is an argument that never ended. In some canon threads, the most dramatic expression of that argument emerges ages later in the form of renewed Netherese power, most notably through the Shadowvar and the City of Shade, heirs to Netheril's arcane traditions, who did not accept that their empire's legacy should remain only a caution. Their return is not a simple resurrection of the old realm, because the world they re-enter is different. The weave is different. The political landscape is different. But their presence demonstrates the one thing Netheril always proved. Human ambition is persistent, and magic is always tempted to serve it. Even when the old heights can't be reached the same way, the desire to reach them does not die. Here is the mid-part anchor, the final reframing that makes Netheril's end feel complete rather than merely tragic. Netheril's fall was not the death of magic. It was the rebirth of magic into a safer form. Mistral's sacrifice and the rise of Mystra did not erase the art. They stabilized it. They preserved a world where spellcasting could continue without being able to tear itself apart at the highest levels. That is why Netheril's catastrophe is remembered as world-shaping. It set a boundary between an era when mortals could climb toward godlike spellcraft and an era where the art itself carries a built-in refusal to allow that kind of rupture again. The Empire did not simply lose. It forced the universe to change the rules. And that is the heaviest epitaph a civilization can have. To be so brilliant, so dangerous, that reality has to protect itself against you. So what, then, was Netheril? It was a human empire that achieved what other peoples considered myth. It systematized wizardry, built institutions of magical knowledge, and raised cities into the sky through engines of continuous power. It fought an ancient, predatory enemy beneath the earth, while also fighting its own internal hunger for dominance. It produced minds like Ulam, whose work suggests enduring architecture, and Karsus, whose ambition was the final leap beyond humility. And it ended not because humans are weak, but because humans were strong enough to attempt theft from the divine foundation of magic itself. Netheril's greatest truth is not that it fell. It is why it fell. Not from ignorance, not from lack, not from simple evil. From the moment it stopped seeing the art as a gift to be wielded responsibly, and started seeing it as a ladder to a throne it believed no one had the right to deny. So when people today wander the edges of a Narok and look out over sand that hides shattered stone, they are not only looking at ruins, they are looking at the memory of a civilization that made miracles mundane and then demanded a miracle too far. Netheril was the greatest empire ever built, and its greatness became the weight that pulled it down.